Welcome to Property Herald with MOGUL.sg. I'm your host Ethan, and today we'll be discussing the recent claims that foreign buyer activity from US citizens will overtake Chinese buyer activity in Singapore's property market. This is a bold claim as Chinese nationals in recent years have been by far the largest buyer group. To debunk these claims, I am joined here today by none other than Nicholas Mark. Nicholas is a veteran in Singapore's property scene and is well known in the industry for his data analysis, insights, and market predictions. It's a pleasure to have him here today to provide his expert opinion on the matter. Welcome, Nicholas.
Thank you, Ethan.
So there has been a recent hike in ABSD rates that mainly affects foreigners. However, there are certain few countries that actually hold a free trade agreement, making them exempt from these ABSD rates. Would you care to go over the details of this free trade agreement?
Because of the free trade agreement that Singapore has with 5 different countries, the citizens and permanent residents from those countries pay the same amount of ABSD as Singaporeans. In other words, they have the same tax treatment as Singaporeans. So if those citizens from these 5 countries buy their one and only private residential property in Singapore, they will be exempted from paying any ABSD. So these 5 countries are Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, Switzerland, and the USA.
So, do you see foreign buyers from these countries, notably the US, causing chaos to take advantage of and to nullify the effects of these ABSD hikes?
Well, that's a very good question, Ethan. I don't think that will ever happen. The reason is because over the last 10 years, the government has actually introduced already a few rounds of cooling measures. So the ABSD, the total debt servicing ratio, and so on are already in place. Take for example, last year, out of every 100 private properties that were sold, 82 of them were bought by Singaporeans. The mainland Chinese buy about 5.2% of the private properties transacted, while Americans bought about 1.7%. The other larger groups of foreign buyers are Malaysians, Indonesians, Australians, and from India. And they typically buy less than 2% of the total number of private homes transacted for the whole of last year. So I don't think that even though the Americans have the same free trade agreement that allows them to have the same tax treatment as Singaporeans, I don't think that alone is enough for the effects of the cooling measures to be nullified.
So there has been an increase in demand for private housing, particularly from American buyers in the years 2021 to 2022. Why do you think that's so?
Well, the number of Singapore private residential properties bought by Americans increased during those 2 years, mainly due to the strong rise in residential rental rates. In that 2 years, 2021 and 2022, the private residential rentals actually increased by a phenomenal 42.5%. By comparison, private residential prices only appreciate by 20% over the same 2 years periods. And since Americans do not need to pay any ABSD if they are buying their one and only property in Singapore, they actually make sense for them to buy instead of renting their homes, because the rents they pay, they can actually use it to pay for the mortgage if they were to buy a private property in Singapore. And in the long run, they actually own that property. But if they continue to rent, the rental they pay will not help them to own the property that they are living in.
Do you ever see Americans becoming a major buyer group in Singapore? I personally don't think so, because they are far geographical distance away from us.
Well, as most people, they will usually buy properties in locations where they are most familiar. Take for example, for the Americans, if they were to buy a second or third property for investment, chances is that they will look for somewhere either within their cities or within America itself. Otherwise, they may invest in properties that are within North America, like for example in Canada or Mexico or some other parts of even Central America. But or other places is like, for example, in the UK or in Europe, where they have some similarities in culture or perhaps ancestry. Some Americans may want to buy properties a bit afar, like for example in Asia, as a holiday home. Like for example, either in Thailand or in Bali, because they may treat that as some sort of a holiday resort. Now, Americans who buy properties in Singapore do so either because they are living and working here, they have family connections here, or some business connections here. So at the moment, they only make up less than 2% of the private properties that are transacted in Singapore. So I don't think that they will want, the numbers will grow tremendously to basically influence the Singapore property market.
So now for the hot topic of the day, the claim that American foreigners are going to overtake Chinese foreigners in terms of purchasing private property in our market. What are your thoughts on this?
I think some people are just cherry-picking the real estate data, and the results can be misleading. In the past 10 years, the majority of the Singapore private residential property buyers who are Chinese citizens are also Singapore permanent residents. That's because it makes sense for them to do so. Among the 13,000 recorded private housing units bought by Chinese citizens, 69% of the properties were bought by those Chinese citizens with Singapore permanent resident status. The remaining 31% of the private residential properties were purchased by Chinese citizens who are not permanent residents in Singapore, in other words, non-PR foreigners. That is because the Singapore permanent residents only pay 5% ABSD, while the non-PR foreigners have to pay a few times more. And right now, they have to pay as much as 60% ABSD on the price of the property. But for the American buyers of Singapore properties, it is the reverse. More Singapore private housing units were bought by Americans who are non-PR foreigners than their fellow countrymen who are Singapore permanent residents. And the reason is because regardless of whether they are PR or non-PR in Singapore, the free trade agreement that America has with Singapore ensure that all of them do not need to pay ABSD if they are buying their one and only property in Singapore. So over the same 10 years period, among the 1,800 recorded private housing units bought by US citizens, 73% of the units were bought by non-PR foreigners from the US, while the remaining 27 units were purchased by Americans who are Singapore permanent residents. It was only in 2022 that the number of private housing units bought by non-PR from China at 267 units, and from the US who bought 252 units. So these two numbers came very close to each other. Therefore, some people are saying that, oh, because of this, the Americans are going to overtake the Chinese as the larger group of foreign buyers. I think this is to give assurance that the latest round of cooling measures, which raised the ABSD to a very high rate, people are concerned, especially some property agents are concerned, that it may actually discourage the Chinese from buying, and the Americans will take over as the largest group of foreign buyers. I don't think this will ever happen because, firstly, China has a much larger population than America, and number two is that for many Chinese, there is some cultural similarities with Singapore and also a lot more business connections with Singapore. So furthermore, some of them also like to send their children to Singapore for education. So as a result, the mainland Chinese buyers are still going to remain as the largest group of foreign buyers of private properties in Singapore.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, for your time today helping us debunk these claims.
You're most welcome, Ethan.
And thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of Property Herald with MOGUL.sg. If you enjoyed what you saw today, be sure to like, comment and subscribe. And follow our social media channels in the description box below for more content like this. Thank you all, goodbye, and we'll see you next time.